All right. So there we have that beautiful, colorful pattern that I think we always associate with Joseph. And just kind of to put everyone who hasn't been reading the story of Joseph recently, just to kind of make sure we have an overview of and a background of what Joseph is all about. We know that Joseph's father was Jacob, who was then later renamed Israel. We know that his mother was Rachel, and that Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife. We know that he had 10 older brothers and 1 younger brother. He had 1 sister that is named. We do have evidence in the Bible that Jacob had other daughters, but only Dinah is named. We also, I think, are quite familiar with the fact that because Joseph was Rachel's firstborn and Rachel had struggled to conceive, Jacob favored Joseph, and he very openly favored Joseph. He gave him the special coat, and it seems like he had other, possibly other privileges that his brothers didn't have. And obviously that ends with his brothers not liking him very much, especially after he receives the colorful coat. It says that they could not speak a nice word to him. So he's not liked by his brothers. He then has some prophetic dreams. He has 2 prophetic dreams. The one where there are 11 sheaves of grain, and they all bow down to his sheaf of grain. And then the other one where the sun, moon, and stars all bow down to him. And it's very interesting. He seems to be quite an innocent young man, because he goes out and he shares this dream about the sheaves of grain, and his brothers hate him for it, and they treat him badly and they mock him. And then he has another dream and he goes and shares that one too. And you kind of think, surely you learned from experience that didn't get a good reaction. Why are you going and you're doing it again? But he does. And it actually obviously got to a point where his brothers disliked him so much that when they found the opportunity, they at first wanted to kill him, and Reuben interceded for him, and they then put him into the pit. And when the Ishmaelite traders came past, they sold him into slavery and they took him to Egypt. So we know that Joseph's life, there's a lot of ups and downs, lots of twists and turns, but we also know that throughout Joseph's life, God was with him. And so I thought we'd just look at some lessons that we can draw out of his life. So the first thing that is evident in Joseph's life is that God works with and through young people. The Bible tells us that Joseph was about 17 years old when he had the dreams. And so he was, by today's estimate at least, 17-year-olds are considered quite young. They're not considered an adult, I think, in any country. And so often, they get disregarded, and one kind of doesn't always perhaps give, young people responsibilities because, well, they're just kids. And I think so much of the teenage frustrations, is precisely that from about, 13, 14 onwards, one wants to be an adult. You want to be doing big things and be seen as being responsible and being able to do things, and you don't get the opportunity. And then that kind of, it's a difficult time to navigate. But Joseph wasn't the only young person that God worked with or through. Some other examples we can think of is David. We know that David was also very young when Samuel came to anoint him as the future king. He was also not really esteemed by his brothers. He was out looking after the sheep to the ceremony until Samuel had to call for him. Esther was a young girl who was asked to undertake a massive leap of faith she had to trust her uncle, and she had to trust God, and she had to navigate something that would have been completely foreign to her. And through that, God was able to work through her to save his people. Josiah, obviously very young, only 8 years old, when he became king of Israel. And we know that right at the end, his life is summarized as he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. So even though he was so young, he was able to do what so many kings before him had not been able to do. And we also have Daniel and his friends. So when they were exiled to Babylon, they were also young men, likely still teenagers. And again, facing a very challenging situation, because we know that they were most likely kind of almost royalty in Israel, and now they were becoming like servants, and they had to adapt and learn new languages, new cultures, and yet still they were able to remain true to their own faith, even though they were now surrounded in this space where no one did really believe in God. So we can see that God is able to work with and through young people, and he can do amazing things with these young people. We also have an amazing example in Joseph of obedience, of integrity, and of hard work. And we know that God, it says in the Bible that you should do all things as to the Lord and not for men. And I think that's very much was embodied in Joseph's life. Even as a young boy, one of the reasons his brothers didn't like him very much is because he told on them. So when they were doing things that was not right, he was the one who would then go and tell Jacob. And obviously no one likes to be told on to, and but Joseph stood up for what is right. We know in Egypt, it tells us that Joseph served Potiphar really well, and God blessed Potiphar and he blessed Joseph to such an extent that eventually Potiphar, literally the Bible tells us, he only worried about what he put in his mouth. He didn't have to worry about anything else regarding his house. He could just focus on his own pleasures, basically. And because of Joseph's hard work, Potiphar himself was blessed, and he grew in wealth and all of that. And unfortunately, we know that it didn't continue going that well. Potiphar's wife was not a good woman, and she wanted Joseph to commit adultery with her. And he continuously rejected her advances, and he made it very clear to her that not only was it wrong because she was married to his master, but he called it a sin against God. So he understood what was right and what was wrong, and he stood up against what was wrong, even to the when, even though she obviously had a position of power, and even if it didn't end up this way, she could have made life really difficult for him. What she then eventually did was to accuse him unjustly, and he was punished for something that he had never done. So he then is in prison, and even in prison, it says that Joseph gained the prison warden's favor. So even though he was supposedly, a criminal, clearly the way that he lived, you could see and know that he was someone you could trust. And the prison warden did trust him, and he also almost became second in charge, even though he was a prisoner himself. He seemed to really be looking out for how to help. We then have the stories where Pharaoh's two prisoners or two servants get thrown in prison, the butler and the baker. And Joseph notices when they are not looking, themselves. He says, you seem to look sad. What's going on? They tell him his dreams, and he then says, well, God can help me to interpret your dreams. And he gives them the interpretation, and we know that those interpretations come true. unfortunately, the butler, once he was back in his position, he forgot about Joseph. So, that could be really disheartening if you think about, you've done something really wonderful for someone, and then they seem to just forget about you, and they don't do anything in return. But thankfully, we know that God was working, and when Pharaoh then has his dreams, the butler does remember about Joseph, and he has Joseph come and interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Pharaoh can see that Joseph, he has the wisdom from God, and he then appoints him as the second in command over all of Egypt, which I think is, that's an incredibly, like, how much responsibility is that, to be given to a former prisoner. And yet, because Joseph, I think, had always had this was what he was obedient, he did have integrity, he wasn't afraid of hard work, he knew what was right and wrong, he would stand up for that. Isn't that what we're all looking for in government officials? But I don't think we find that in today's governments. And we know that Joseph was very successful in this position. He was given a wife, he had children, and at that point it really seems that Joseph had now reached, a high in his life. So even though right in the beginning it seems that all of his good decisions and standing up for what is right seems to count against him, in the long run, it really counts in his favor. Another lesson that I kind of drew out from this story is this idea of vengeance belongs to God, that God will repay. So this actually comes from the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy 32. I'm not sure if I've got that on here. And this is where God tells Israel, you shouldn't try and take revenge, that vengeance belongs to God, he will repay. And so now we know, continuing on the story of Joseph, there is the famine, just as it was predicted. And the famine is not just in Egypt, it's in the surrounding countries too. So Jacob and his sons are also suffering because of this famine, and they learn that in Egypt there is still food. So Jacob sends his sons, all except Benjamin, to go to Egypt and to buy some food. And they don't know that their brother is the one who is in charge, and they don't recognize Joseph. And so now he is in a position where he is able to punish them. He's in the position of power. This is many, many years later. So you wonder, with the brothers, did they perhaps think that they had gotten away with, selling Joseph and telling the lie that he had been killed? Jacob obviously believed them. As long as they kept the secret among themselves, it really did seem like they had gotten away with this sin that they committed. When Joseph does see him, he doesn't reveal himself right away, and he seems to want to test how they're treating Benjamin most of all. I think the Bible doesn't tell us outright, but I think he's wondering whether, when he was now gone, did Benjamin become the next sort of victim? Because we know that Jacob didn't learn his lesson, and he did favor Benjamin once Joseph was gone. And he doesn't want Benjamin. One of Joseph's tests was that Benjamin had to come to Egypt, and Jacob didn't want to send Benjamin. And then Joseph tries to keep Benjamin in Egypt, and the brothers, actually, I think it's Judah who said, rather keep me, but you can't keep Benjamin. Benjamin has to go back. And so Joseph was able to see that they had at least matured, in that they weren't being as cruel to Benjamin as they had been to him. So Joseph forgave his brothers, and it says that he was overcome with emotion. He wanted them to come near to him. He wanted to be with them. He told him to come, to Egypt. And what is evident, though, is at first, when he's testing his brothers, they immediately think, they're like, the first thing that they go to is they say, this is happening to us because of what we did to Joseph. We heard how he was crying out to us and we ignored him. And that is why God is punishing us now. So, I mean, how true is that not for us as well? Sometimes we do something that we know is not right. And even though no one else might know about it, it stays on your subconscious. And when things then do happen, it's I think human nature to be like, yeah, it's because I did that thing. What also might happen is if you get into a kind of a situation where you did something that's not right, and then someone else knows about it, like those 10 brothers all knew the secret, and that gives that person leverage over you because now they know they have something against you. And I think that's it's not a pleasant way to go through life, to constantly have this baggage that you're carrying with you because of something that you did wrong. But God does say that he will repay, and the Bible doesn't tell us whether they had to eventually confess what they had done to Jacob. It would seem, I think it would be the logical thing, but perhaps they just, I don't know, maybe a wild animal didn't kill Joseph and he managed to escape to Egypt. But you'd hope that they did learn their lesson as well, and that they did then tell Jacob the truth about what had happened. As I said, this verse originally, this idea comes from Deuteronomy, but the Apostle Paul also refers to this in Romans, where he says, repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So that's a very powerful lesson. As human beings, things have to be fair, especially if you look at children. This concept of leaving it to God requires a great deal of maturity. And I think the extent to what we are able to do this probably reflects a great deal on how spiritually mature we have become. And then another lesson is that all things do work together for good. Joseph's prophetic dreams that we mentioned right in the beginning, when he went to his brothers and he told them about these sheaves of grain that bowed to his sheaf and the sun, moon, and stars bowing to him, they interpreted it as he was going to be a ruler and he was going to lord it over them, and he was going to maybe inherit, their father's wealth. And because they interpreted it that way, they disliked him. Where when we look at how God made it work, eventually it actually turned out that Joseph wasn't in a position of, lording it over them, but he was placed in a position where he was able to save them because of the power that he had. And so it's amazing how God's design, we can't always see that. We can't see the end from the beginning the way God does. And so I think we need to be careful of jumping to conclusions. We saw throughout Joseph's life that no matter the situation that he was in, and he was in a lot of very difficult situations, he continued to make good choices. And I think that's really important. We need to have that understanding in us already, so that when we do go through difficult times, we know the right choices to make. And I think that's something that, you can start working at right now, but I'm jumping ahead of myself. So let's look at the next thing first. We know that God took all of these challenges in Joseph's life and he turned them into blessings. That reference there is where Joseph speaks to his brothers and he says that you intended it for evil, you intended to kill me, but God intended it for good. And he has now put me into a position where I'm able to help you. So he definitely could look back at his life and he could see God's hand at work, and he gave God the glory for that. Again, the Apostle Paul speaks to that in Romans again, and this is quite I think a familiar verse, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So with my Sunday school class, one of the little things I had them do was I kind of went through all the highlights or the main points in Joseph's life. And if it was a good thing that was happening to Joseph, they had to go like up high. They had to show me it was a high point of Joseph's life. And if it was a bad thing that was happening to Joseph, they had to bend down and go down low. And it was a lot of fun because Joseph really did have a roller coaster of a life. There was a lot of really amazing things. And then there was like some really, really hard times. But I do think that probably we could all relate to this. I think, not all of us have as bad experiences. We don't get thrown into prison and things like that. But there are times that are hard. And then there are times that are good. And there are kind of those in-between times. But what we can know through all of these ups and downs is that God will be with you. So we know in Genesis that it says Yahweh was with Joseph. Every time that like a bad thing happens to Joseph, when he gets sent to Egypt, when he gets thrown into prison, those verses say Yahweh was with Joseph. And we know from the book of Joshua, it says, do not be afraid. Yahweh, your God, is with you. And so we have that promise from God that he will be with us. But what is important, and this was actually quite interesting, it's a story that I came across in 2018. What happened was this woman and her daughter were driving, and a motorbike crashed into the passenger side of the car where her daughter was sitting, her 11-year-old daughter. And it caused a head injury that they thought was not as serious, but overnight her brain just continued to swell. And what they had to do is they had to actually cut her skull out so that the brain could have space. And then they implanted her skull into her stomach, into her abdomen, so that the blood could flow and keep the bone alive. And it's apparently a very, very risky surgery. And it only has about a 5% recovery rate. This happened here in South Africa, in Durban. And this mom was a blogger and a Christian, and she then shared like these updates about her daughter. And it was an absolute miracle. This little girl that they basically said her brain had been deprived of oxygen. She'll be a vegetable. Has made a complete full recovery. She's doing ballet. She has no balance issues. She has no memory issues. She has no cognitive challenges. It's the most incredible miracle how she has recovered. But what this mom said, they asked her when it had just happened and they were in this situation where they didn't know whether this little girl was going to live or not, how was she able to still trust in God? Because she said she knew the outcome was assured. She didn't know what the outcome was, but she knew that God already had the outcome planned, and that she trusted that God was good, no matter what the outcome was. And so they asked her, how are you able to do that when, you're sitting and you don't know whether your daughter's going to live or not? And she said, it's not something that you just do in that moment. It's about what you are formed around in the really, the boring times of life, when you're reading, Leviticus or Numbers, and you're thinking, like, why am I reading this? There's nothing that's really jumping out at me and speaking to me, and there's no incredible things happening right now. But in that consistency of just being with God in all the situations, you become formed around his word and around his promises, so that when those bad things happen, it's there. It's not something that you need to go find. It's already there. And that can then carry you through. So that was something that I happened to come across again, but I think that really is what we can see in Joseph's life as well. Throughout the everything that happened to him, he definitely already knew God, and he knew God's promises, and he knew what was right. And because he was formed around that was consistent, and people could see that.